Listen, if someone had told Tavian that his biggest challenge on Outpost Meridian would involve explaining hugs to a species of apex predators who thought affection was a myth told by the weak, he probably would have stayed on Earth and stuck to grafting tomatoes. But here we are. Outpost Meridian wasn't much to look at, honestly. A collection of interconnected modules spinning lazily around a nebula that looked pretty in promotional materials, but mostly just screwed with the long-range sensors. The place served as neutral ground for a dozen species, trying very hard not to murder each other while pretending to conduct important research. Humans ran the hydroponics bay and medical wing. The Quentar managed communications. The Rothani handled security, which was hilarious because they were essentially angry mushrooms with authority issues. And then there were the Nexarath. Scratch that. Consider a species that evolved on a planet where the prevailing philosophy was kill or be killed, and maybe kill anyway, just to stay in practice. Desert world, twin suns, permanent drought. The kind of place where showing your belly meant you were about to become dinner, and offering a handshake would get your arm ripped off as a sign of disrespect. The Nexarath stood roughly 8 feet tall, covered in dense russet and amber scales that could deflect most small arms fire. Their faces were elongated, almost draconic, with rows of teeth that had absolutely no business being that sharp unless you planned to hunt something that fought back. Eyes like molten copper, unblinking, constantly calculating threat assessments. They moved with the fluid grace of persistence predators, the kind that didn't chase you down in a sprint, but simply followed you until you collapsed from exhaustion. Terrifying? Absolutely. But they paid their docking fees on time and mostly kept to themselves, which made them model tenants as far as Outpost Meridian was concerned. Tavian had been stationed there for nearly 8 months, and in that time he'd exchanged maybe 20 words with the Nexarath delegation, mostly variations of "excuse me" when navigating the narrow corridors. They didn't socialize, didn't eat in the common areas, barely acknowledged other species existed except when protocol demanded it, which made the arrival of Ambassador Ral Neth and his clutch something of an event. "Diplomatic vessel incoming," Autumn announced over the station-wide comm, her voice carrying that special blend of authority and exhaustion that came from managing what was essentially a cosmic truck stop. Nexarath transport. They're bringing younglings. Everyone play nice. And for the love of all that's holy, nobody offer them candy or ask to pet them. Tavian was elbow-deep in a recalcitrant irrigation valve when the announcement crackled through. He swore, banged his head on the underside of the planting bed, and decided the universe was conspiring against him specifically. Younglings. Great, because regular Nexarath weren't intimidating enough. The docking went smoothly, which meant nobody died and nothing exploded. Tavian watched from the observation deck as the Nexarath vessel locked into place, a sleek, predatory thing that looked like it could bite through the station's hull if it got annoyed. The airlock cycled, pressure equalized, and then they came through. Ambassador Ral Neth first, naturally. He was massive even by Nexarath standards, his scales bearing the scarification patterns of someone who'd won a lot of fights. He moved through the corridor like he owned it, which, to be fair, was probably how he moved everywhere. Behind him came 6 smaller figures, ranging from maybe 5 to 6 feet tall. The cubs. They looked like miniature versions of their elders, all scales and teeth and predatory focus. But there was something almost uncertain in the way they moved. Their eyes tracked everything, constantly scanning. But it wasn't the lazy confidence of adult Nexarath. It was vigilance born of anxiety. They kept their distance from each other, maintaining at least an arm's length of space at all times, as if proximity itself was dangerous. "They're so tense," Lillian murmured beside him. The station psychologist had appeared without warning, which was her specialty. She was supposedly analyzing crew morale, but Tavian suspected she just liked watching people and making uncomfortably accurate observations about their emotional states. "They're predators," Tavian said. "Tense is probably default." "Maybe," Lillian tilted her head, studying the cubs with professional interest. "Or maybe they've been taught that relaxation equals vulnerability. Look at how they hold themselves. That's not hunting posture. That's fear posture, trying very hard to look like hunting posture." Before Tavian could respond, the universe decided to speedrun his inevitable humiliation. He'd been backing away from the observation window, not watching where he was going, because his brain was still cataloging how deeply unsettling it was to see juvenile apex predators walking around the station. His shoulder collided with something solid and warm, and definitely not a wall. Tavian spun around and found himself staring directly into the copper eyes of a Nexarath cub. The cub, who he'd later learn was named Mirago, froze. Absolutely froze. Every muscle locked, scales flattening against his body in a defensive posture. Those eyes went wide, pupils contracting to slits, and for a moment, Tavian was genuinely concerned he was about to get mauled by someone who barely came up to his chest. "Oh, God, I'm so sorry," Tavian blurted, raising his hands in what he desperately hoped was a universal gesture of non-aggression. "I wasn't looking. Totally my fault. Are you okay?" Mirago stared at him, then stared at his raised hands, then looked back at his face with an expression Tavian couldn't begin to interpret. "You apologize?" The translator, device clipped to the cub's harness, rendered the words in flat, universal common. But there was audible confusion in the underlying vocalizations. "Well, yeah. I bumped into you. That was rude." "You struck me." Mirago's head tilted at an angle that would have required a chiropractor on a human. "Even accidentally. This establishes dominance hierarchy. You should be asserting superiority, not expressing regret." Tavian blinked. No, that's not how we do things. I made a mistake. Mistakes get apologies." The cub continued staring. His scales gradually relaxed from their defensive flatten, but the confusion didn't leave his eyes. "Your species is very strange." "You have no idea," Lillian said cheerfully, stepping into the conversation with the fearlessness of someone who'd never met a social situation she couldn't psychoanalyze. "I'm Lillian, station psychologist. You must be part of Ambassador Ral Neth's clutch. Welcome to Outpost Meridian." Mirago's attention shifted to her, then back to Tavian, then to the hand Tavian was still holding out in a half-aborted handshake gesture. "What is the purpose of the extended manipulator appendage?" "Oh, handshake. It's a greeting. You clasp hands briefly, shows goodwill. You grasp each other voluntarily, without combat intent?" "Correct." Mirago processed this information with the gravity of someone learning that gravity might be optional. "Why?" "Because it's friendly." "Fascinating," the cub murmured, and something in his tone suggested Tavian had just become a very interesting science project. Before the interaction could get weirder, Ambassador Ral Neth's voice rumbled from down the corridor. "Mirago, attend." The cub straightened immediately, all traces of curiosity vanishing behind a mask of rigid formality. He gave Tavian and Lillian a curt nod, then retreated to where the other cubs had assembled in a perfectly spaced formation. No warmth, no casual proximity. Just 6 young predators maintaining their designated territory. Well, Lillian said as they walked away, that was illuminating. That was terrifying. That too. She tapped her datapad thoughtfully. Did you notice how surprised he was by basic courtesy? They don't apologize, don't shake hands, probably don't have any casual physical contact at all. Why would they? They're raised to fight. Maybe. Or maybe they're raised in isolation, because nobody taught them there's any other way. Lillian's expression turned contemplative. Touch deprivation can cause serious developmental issues in social species. I wonder if anyone's ever studied whether the Nexarath qualify as social. Tavian was about to point out that studying the psychological issues of a species that could rip you apart seemed like a poor life choice. But the conversation got interrupted by Naveen jogging past, chasing down a floating toolkit that had escaped its magnetic lock. One of the junior technicians, a kid named Thomas who was perpetually homesick, sat slumped against the corridor wall looking miserable. Naveen grabbed the toolkit, then crouched beside Tomas. "Hey, still missing your family?" "It's stupid," Tomas muttered. "I signed up for this. Knew what I was getting into." "Doesn't make it stupid." Naveen pulled the kid into a quick, fierce hug. "Missing people you love is the most human thing there is. You're doing great. Your parents would be proud." Thomas sagged into the embrace, some of the tension bleeding out of his shoulders. "Thanks, man." "Anytime." It was such a casual moment, the kind that happened a dozen times a day on the station. Humans being humans, offering comfort through contact because that's what they did. Tavian wouldn't have thought anything of it except for one small detail. Down the corridor, half hidden behind a structural support beam, 6 Nexarath cubs were watching. Their translator devices were active, picking up the conversation. Their copper eyes tracked every movement. And when Naveen wrapped his arms around Thomas, all 6 cubs went absolutely still. Mirago's mouth moved, forming words too quiet for the translators to catch. But the other cubs leaned in, listening. One of them, a smaller female with darker scales, reached out as if to touch the cub beside her, then snatched her hand back like she'd been burned. "Lillian," Tavian said quietly, "are you seeing this?" "Oh, I'm seeing it." The psychologist's voice had gone sharp with professional interest. "And unless I'm very wrong, we just accidentally taught a species of touch-averse predators that physical contact can mean something other than violence." "Is that good or bad?" "Yes." The cubs watched for another moment, then retreated when Ambassador Ral Neth's heavy footsteps announced his approach. They fell back into their rigid formation, properly spaced, appropriately isolated. But Mirago glanced back once, his copper eyes finding Tavian across the corridor. And Tavian, who'd spent 8 months peacefully tending plants and avoiding interspecies incidents, had the distinct sinking feeling that his quiet life was about to get very, very complicated. He had no idea how right he was. The thing about predators, Tavian learned over the next few days, is that they're really, really good at watching. Patient. Methodical. The kind of observation that makes you check over your shoulder even when you know rationally that the juvenile alien death machine studying you from behind the mess hall napkin dispenser is probably not going to eat you. Probably. Mirago had apparently appointed himself chief researcher of bizarre human customs, and he took the job seriously. Tavian would be calibrating nutrient levels in the hydroponics bay and catch a flicker of russet scales in his peripheral vision. He'd turn, and there would be Mirago, datapad clutched in clawed hands, taking notes with the intensity of someone documenting a new species of extremely dangerous bacteria. "Can I help you?" Tavian asked. On the 3rd day of this, looking up from a particularly stubborn tomato plant that refused to acknowledge the concept of vertical growth. Mirago's scales rippled in what might have been embarrassment. I am conducting observational research for my educational development. Ambassador Ral Neth says we must understand the species we will negotiate with in future diplomatic assignments. Right. And you're studying me because you are the least threatening human on the station. Tavian wasn't sure whether to be offended or relieved. Thanks? It is factual assessment, not insult. Your physical parameters suggest minimal combat capability. Your primary function involves nurturing plant life. You emit no threat pheromones. You are ideal for initial data collection. I'm a starter human. Got it. Tavian turned back to his tomato. Well, observe away, I guess. Just don't touch anything without asking. Some of these plants are poisonous. Mirago's eyes widened fractionally. You cultivate toxic species? For what strategic purpose? I cultivate tomatoes. They're food. The leaves are poisonous, but the fruit is delicious. The cub processed this information with visible confusion. Your species deliberately tends organisms that could harm you simply for marginal nutritional benefit? We also think they taste good. Taste. Pleasure-based consumption, rather than optimal caloric intake. Mirago made a note. Fascinating. Inefficient, but fascinating. This became the pattern. Mirago would lurk, observe, and occasionally ask questions that made Tavian reconsider everything he'd taken for granted about being human. Why do you smile at each other? Why do you waste time on verbal pleasantries when efficient communication is possible? Why do you walk beside each other instead of in optimal defensive formation? But the questions that really seemed to consume the cub all centered on one thing: physical contact. Mirago watched Lillian squeeze a colleague's shoulder in encouragement. He documented Naveen's elaborate handshake routine with the engineering team. He observed Autumn clapping someone on the back after a job well done. Every instance of casual human touch got recorded, analyzed, and apparently discussed among the other cubs during whatever counted as their free time. Tavian started noticing all 6 cubs showing up in various locations around the station, always watching, always taking notes, like a tiny academic surveillance team made of scales and teeth. It was Lillian who made the connection. They think we're broken, she announced, dropping into the seat across from Tavian in the mess hall. Tavian looked up from his truly disappointing attempt at station-synthesized coffee. What? The cubs. They've developed a working theory about human tactile behavior, and it's adorable and completely wrong. Lillian pulled up her datapad, showing him a series of observational logs she'd compiled. Listen to this. I've been monitoring their educational sessions through the translation relay. Don't look at me like that. It's for research purposes. Anyway, they're trying to figure out why we touch each other so much, and their current hypothesis is medical. Medical. They think our internal organs are poorly designed and require frequent external manipulation to maintain proper alignment. Tavian choked on his coffee. They think what? It makes sense from their perspective. They come from a species where touch equals violence or dominance assertion. Physical contact is inherently aggressive, so when they see us hugging each other, they're trying to rationalize it within their existing framework. And the conclusion they've reached is that humans must have some kind of chronic structural instability that requires regular physical intervention. So when Naveen hugged Thomas, Mirago logged it as emergency repair protocol initiated in response to visible distress indicators. The other cubs are calling hugs heart repairs because their translators are doing something weird with the idiom heartache, and they think we're literally fixing cardiovascular damage. Tavian stared at her, then started laughing, because the alternative was screaming. "Oh my God! They think we're all walking around with broken hearts that need constant maintenance." Metaphorically accurate, often literally incorrect. Lillian grinned. But here's the interesting part. They're not dismissing it as weakness anymore. They're treating it like a legitimate medical necessity. I overheard Pixtal, the little one, telling the others that humans must be incredibly resilient to function despite having such catastrophically fragile internal architecture. We've gone from weak to impressively dysfunctional. Progress. Actually, yes. Lillian's expression turned more serious. Because they're not mocking it. They're trying to understand it. And I think some of them are starting to wonder what it feels like. That thought sat heavy in the air between them. The idea that these cubs, raised in isolation, trained for diplomacy through controlled aggression, might be experiencing something they didn't have words for. Curiosity, maybe. Or longing for something they'd never been taught to want. The theory gained evidence that evening. Tavian was doing his routine maintenance check on the oxygen recyclers, a job that was exactly as boring as it sounded, when he noticed two cubs lurking near the recreation area. Athrea and Lochmere, if he remembered the names correctly. They were positioned behind a structural column, clearly trying to be stealthy, which might have worked better if they weren't both over 5 feet tall and covered in reflective scales. He was about to announce his presence when he realized what they were watching. Movie night. The station's human contingent had a tradition of gathering once a week to watch old films on the main view screen. Tonight's selection was some romantic comedy from the 2040s, the kind of forgettable fluff that nonetheless had people laughing and throwing popcorn at the screen during the particularly ridiculous moments. But what had the cubs transfixed wasn't the movie itself. It was the humans watching it. Couples leaning against each other, friends with arms draped over shoulders, someone's head resting on someone else's lap. The casual, constant contact that humans did without thinking. The tactile language of comfort and companionship. Athrea's translator picked up enough of her whisper for Tavian to hear. They perform the repair protocols even during leisure activities. The structural damage must be continuous. Or the repairs are preventative, Lochmere countered. Maintaining organ alignment before catastrophic failure occurs. It is actually quite logical. But they seem to enjoy it. Look at their biometric indicators, relaxed musculature, decreased respiration rates, elevated serotonin markers if Lillian's human biology lectures are accurate. The repair process produces positive neurochemical responses. Brilliant evolutionary adaptation. Lochmere made a note on his pad. Their species turned a medical necessity into a pleasurable experience. No wonder they're so resilient, despite their physical limitations. Tavian should have announced himself. Should have corrected their absolutely incorrect but weirdly logical conclusion. Should have explained that humans weren't held together with hugs like some kind of emotional duct tape. But he didn't, because Athrea did something that made him freeze. She reached out, slowly, hesitantly, and let her clawed hand rest against Lochmere's shoulder, just barely touching, the lightest possible contact. Lochmere went rigid, his scales flattened in alarm. For a heartbeat, Tavian thought he was about to witness a fight. Then Lochmere's scales slowly relaxed. Not all the way, but enough. And he didn't pull away. "What?" Lochmere's voice was barely audible. "What does this achieve?" "I am uncertain." Athrea sounded equally confused. "But the humans do it constantly. Perhaps we should gather data through direct experimentation." "That would be highly inappropriate." We are Nexarath. We do not engage in frivolous physical contact. Of course not. This is research, purely academic. They stood there, this tiny point of contact between them, looking for all the world like they'd just discovered fire, and weren't quite sure if it was going to burn them. Eventually, they separated. Proper distance restored. But something had changed in the way they held themselves. Less rigid, almost uncertain. Tavian retreated before they noticed him, his mind spinning. What had he just witnessed? Cubs from a touch-averse species experimenting with contact because they'd decided humans were onto something, even if their reasoning was completely backwards? He found Lillian in her office, because of course he did. Where else would you take an emotional crisis? They're trying it, he said without preamble. The cubs. They're testing physical contact with each other. Lillian looked up from her reports, eyebrows rising. Based on their human observation studies? Based on their completely incorrect theory that we're all broken and need constant repairs, yes. Huh. She leaned back, tapping her stylus against her teeth. That's either going to be beautiful or a complete disaster. Why not both? Fair point. Lillian pulled up her monitoring data. I've been tracking their stress markers. Did you know that Nexarath cubs on their homeworld have significantly elevated cortisol levels compared to adults? The Nexarath chalked it up to developmental biology, but now I'm wondering if it's chronic touch starvation. Humans need physical contact for healthy development. Most social species do. But the Nexarath built an entire culture around avoiding it. So these cubs are essentially running on empty, emotionally speaking. And they just figured out that humans have something they don't. They don't understand what it is. They've completely misidentified why we do it. But they know we have it. And I think some of them want it. As if summoned by the conversation, Tavian's door chime activated. He opened it to find Mirago standing in the corridor, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. I require information, the cub said formally. Sure, come in. Mirago entered, maintaining careful distance, his datapad clutched like a security blanket. I have been studying human tactile interaction protocols, and I have questions that my database cannot adequately address. Okay, shoot. The heart repair process. When is it medically necessary? What are the indicators that prompt humans to initiate the protocol? Are there contraindications? Can excessive repairs cause harm? Tavian exchanged a glance with Lillian, who was clearly trying not to laugh. Mirago, Tavian said gently, we need to clear something up. Hugs aren't medical procedures. They're not repairs. We're not broken. The cub's scales rippled with confusion. But I have observed clear patterns. Humans initiate physical contact in response to distress, before separation events, after successful completion of tasks, and during bonding activities. This serves regulatory function. You are maintaining something. Emotional health, Lillian offered, not physical repairs. We touch each other because it makes us feel better psychologically. It releases hormones that reduce stress and promote bonding. It's communication, comfort, connection. Mirago stared at her like she'd just explained that humans breathe through their feet. You have an entire biological system dedicated to emotional regulation through physical contact? Pretty much, yeah. And this is normal? For your species? Completely normal. Essential, actually. Human children who don't get enough physical affection develop serious psychological problems. Adults, too, though we're better at managing it. The cub was quiet for a long moment, processing. When he spoke again, his voice was smaller, younger. And the cubs, human children, they receive this regularly? All the time. Hugs, hand-holding, cuddling. It's how we show love and care. Love! The translator struggled with the word. The bonding emotion that humans frequently reference in cultural materials. That's the one. Another long silence. Mirago's claws tapped against his datapad in what might have been a nervous gesture. Nexarath cubs are raised in individual development pods. We are fed, educated, and trained. Physical contact occurs only during combat instruction or dominance establishment. We are taught that proximity equals vulnerability. Isolation equals strength. The weight of that statement hung in the air. Mirago, Lillian said softly, "Can I ask you something? How does isolation feel?" Feel? The cub's head tilted. It is not a matter of feeling. It is standard protocol. But if it were a matter of feeling? Mirago's scales shivered. For just a moment, the rigid, trained exterior cracked, and Tavian saw what Lillian had already identified. A scared kid, trying very hard to pretend he wasn't. "It feels," Mirago whispered, "like something is missing. Like there is a space inside that should be filled. But I do not know with what. And watching humans, I think you have what fills that space. And I do not understand why my species decided we do not need it." Tavian's heart cracked. Just a little. Just enough. "Would you like to try?" he asked quietly. "A hug. The real thing. Not a repair protocol. Just to see what it's like?" Mirago looked up at him with those copper eyes, so much older than they should be, and so much more uncertain than his culture allowed. "That would be acceptable, for research purposes." "Right, research." Tavian stood, moving slowly, and opened his arms. "It's optional. You can stop any time. Just, if you want, step forward." Mirago hesitated. Every instinct the Nexarath had bred into him was probably screaming warnings. Proximity equals danger. Touch equals violence. Vulnerability equals death. He stepped forward anyway. Tavian wrapped his arms carefully around the cub's shoulders, mindful of the scales and the fact that this kid could probably break his ribs without trying. Mirago stood frozen, rigid, every muscle locked. Then, slowly, something shifted. The cub's scales relaxed, his breathing steadied, and he made a sound that the translator couldn't process, but that Tavian's hindbrain recognized instantly. The sound of someone who'd been holding themselves together for way too long, finally. Finally, letting go. Mirago's arms came up, hesitant, and returned the embrace. Clumsy, uncertain, but genuine. And from his chest came a low, rumbling vibration, almost like a purr. "Oh," Mirago whispered. "Oh, this is what was missing." Tavian met Lillian's eyes over the cub's head. Her expression said everything. This is going to get complicated. This is going to cause problems. This is going to change things. And also, this is the right thing to do. When Mirago finally pulled back, his scales were brighter than Tavian had ever seen them. "I must inform the others. They need to know. We all need to know." He left at a run, datapad forgotten on the table. Lillian picked it up, scanning the notes. "Well, we just accidentally revolutionized Nexarath emotional development. That's going on my annual review. Think it'll cause problems? Oh, definitely. But problems worth having." Tavian couldn't argue with that. Outside, in the corridors of Outpost Meridian, 6 Nexarath cubs were about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is admit you need something gentle. And somewhere in the station, Ambassador Ral Neth was about to discover that his carefully controlled diplomatic mission had just gone completely off the rails. The line started forming at exactly 2200 hours station time, which Tavian only discovered because his door chime woke him from a perfectly good dream about tomatoes that grew themselves. He stumbled to the door in his sleep shirt, expecting a maintenance emergency or possibly Lillian with some new psychological crisis to dissect. Instead, he found 6 Nexarath cubs standing in the corridor in single file, perfectly spaced, looking like the galaxy's most intimidating and also most awkward queue. Mirago stood at the front, datapad clutched to his chest. Behind him, Pixtal, Lochmere, Athrea, Norix, and Kilana, all maintaining that careful Nexarath distance from each other while simultaneously radiating an energy that could only be described as desperately hopeful. "Ah," Tavian said eloquently. "Hi?" "We request heart repairs," Mirago announced, with the formality of someone ordering artillery strikes. "I have explained the process to the others. They wish to experience the emotional regulation protocol. We have formed an orderly distribution system to ensure efficient processing." "You made a hug schedule." "Correct. I will receive the first repair as I have seniority. Pixtal will follow as she is smallest and potentially most structurally compromised. Then Lochmere, Athrea, Norix, and Kilana in descending order of observed stress markers." Tavian stared at them. All 6 cubs stared back with those unblinking copper eyes, scales shimmering with what he was learning to recognize as nervous anticipation. "It's past 2200 hours, he said weakly. "Affirmative. Mirago's research indicates humans are less occupied during rest cycle hours. We calculated this would minimize disruption to your primary functions." "That's thoughtful. But also, I was sleeping." Pixtal's scales drooped slightly. "We have committed a social error. Apologies. We will return during appropriate operational hours." The disappointment in her voice was devastating. Tavian, who prided himself on being relatively immune to manipulation, found his resistance crumbling like a stale cookie. No, it's fine. Come on, let's, process some repairs." The cubs filed into his quarters with military precision, arranging themselves along the wall while maintaining their spacing. Tavian suddenly felt very aware that his living space was extremely human. Messy, covered in plant cuttings, with a truly embarrassing poster of Earth's Grand Canyon on the wall. Mirago stepped forward. "I am ready for the procedure." "Right. So, same as before. Just come here." The second hug went easier than the first. Mirago leaned into it immediately, that rumbling purr starting up almost instantly. When they separated, the cub's eyes were bright. "Therapeutic effect confirmed," he announced to the others. "Proceed with confidence." Pixtal approached next, moving with the hesitant steps of someone walking into unknown territory. She was the smallest, her scales a deeper burgundy than the others, and when Tavian wrapped his arms around her, she basically disappeared into the embrace. The sound she made was definitely a purr, but higher pitched, almost like a chirp. She trembled for a moment, then went absolutely still, and Tavian felt wetness against his shirt. "Are you okay?" he whispered. "I did not know." Pixtal's voice was muffled against his shoulder. That not being alone could feel like this. Tavian's heart shattered into approximately 1,000,000 pieces. One by one, the cubs stepped forward. Lochmere, who tried very hard to maintain stoic dignity and failed spectacularly when his purring started. Athrea, who kept whispering "fascinating" while calculating the neurochemical responses happening in her brain. Norix, who was so tense Tavian worried he might actually break something before he finally relaxed. Kilana, who didn't purr, but made a soft trilling sound that the translator rendered as something like contentment. By the time the last cub had been hugged, Tavian was emotionally exhausted, and also pretty sure he'd just accidentally adopted 6 juvenile apex predators. "Same time tomorrow?" Mirago asked hopefully. "Sure, but maybe a bit earlier? Like 2,000 hours?" "Acceptable. We will adjust the schedule accordingly." They filed out with the same precision they'd entered, except now their scales were brighter, their postures less rigid. As Pixtal passed through the door, she paused and looked back. "Thank you, Tavian, for fixing what we did not know was broken." After they left, Tavian stood in his quarters, staring at nothing, until Lillian's face appeared on his comm screen. "I have the security feeds," she said without preamble. That was simultaneously the most adorable and most heartbreaking thing I've ever witnessed. Also, congratulations on your new nightly obligation. This is going to become a thing, isn't it? Oh, this is absolutely going to become a thing. She was right. The next night, the queue formed at 2,000 hours sharp. And the night after that. And the night after that. The cubs were nothing if not consistent. Word spread among the human crew. Naveen started taking 2 cubs per night. Lillian handled 3. Even Autumn, the station commander who'd seen actual combat and once stared down a Rothani war council, found herself with Pixtal showing up at her door, requesting what the cubs were now calling contact therapy sessions. The humans found it endearing. The cubs treated it with the seriousness of vital medical treatment. And for 5 glorious days, it seemed like maybe this weird cross-species bonding experiment might actually work. Then Ambassador Ral Neth found out. Tavian was in the hydroponics bay when the explosion happened. Not a literal explosion, though the volume of Ral Neth's roar suggested something had detonated nearby. The ambassador's voice carried through 3 bulkheads and 2 airlocks, a sustained bellow of rage that made the station's structural supports vibrate. "What have you done to my cubs?" Tavian looked at the tomato plant he'd been pruning. Well, it was nice while it lasted. The plant, wisely, said nothing. Through the observation window, he could see Ral Neth storming down the corridor, scales fully extended in aggression display, with Mirago trailing behind looking smaller than Tavian had ever seen him. This, Tavian reflected, was about to get very complicated. The tomatoes continued their policy of strategic silence. Smart tomatoes. Ambassador Ral Neth was 8 feet of barely contained volcanic fury, and he'd chosen the main corridor intersection for his public dismantling of human Nexarath relations. Strategic choice, really. Maximum audience, optimal acoustics for intimidation, and enough space to loom impressively. "You have contaminated my clutch," he snarled, towering over Tavian while a growing crowd of various species pretended not to watch, while absolutely watching. "Weaken them with your soft prey species nonsense. They sneak from their quarters. They seek your company. They have become dependent on your bizarre physical rituals." Tavian, who'd spent the walk here preparing approximately 15 diplomatic responses, heard himself say, "Yeah, because they were starving." Ral Neth's scales flared. They receive optimal nutrition, full dietary supplementation. I personally oversee their... Not food. Tavian was apparently committed to this suicide mission now. Affection, connection, basic touch. You've been training warriors, but you've been starving children. The corridor went silent. Even the Rothani stopped their mushroomy murmuring. Ral Neth leaned down until his face was inches from Tavian's, breath hot and smelling faintly of whatever Nexarath ate that Tavian definitely didn't want to know about. "You dare lecture me on raising Nexarath young? You, whose species coddles offspring until they are useless? We forge strength through isolation. We build warriors through discipline. We do not produce weak, needy creatures who crave constant validation. You're right. Lillian's voice cut through the tension. She'd materialized from somewhere, datapad in hand, looking like every therapist who'd ever calmly delivered devastating news. You don't produce weak creatures. You produce chronically stressed ones with elevated cortisol, suppressed oxytocin, and underdeveloped social bonding capabilities. I've run the numbers. Your cub's stress markers dropped 40% after initiating regular physical contact. Their cognitive performance improved. Their aggression toward each other decreased while their cooperative behaviors increased. You're not protecting them from weakness. You're denying them a basic biological need. Nexarath do not need... Everyone needs touch, Lillian interrupted, which was bold considering she was contradicting someone who could bite her head off. Literally. Every social species. You built a culture around deprivation and called it strength. But all you did was traumatize generations of cubs who grew into adults who didn't know they were suffering. Ral Neth's claws scraped against the deck plating. This is anthropocentric bias, applying your weak standards to a superior species. Then explain Mirago. They all turned. The cub stood at the edge of the crowd, scales dull with misery, but his voice was steady. Explain why the first time a human embraced me, I felt like I could finally breathe. Explain why every night in my development pod felt like drowning in nothing. Explain why I have vocabulary for 17 types of combat strikes, but no words for what it feels like when someone holds you and you are safe. Ral Neth stared at his cub like he'd never seen him before. I am not weak, Mirago continued, moving forward with the careful precision of someone navigating a minefield. I am not compromised. I am not contaminated. I am learning that strength does not require isolation. That needing others is not failure. That maybe, Ambassador, our entire species has been wrong about what makes us strong. You are a child. You understand nothing of... I understand that Pixtol stopped having night terrors after Autumn started tucking her in with contact therapy. I understand that Lockmir's academic performance improved when Naveen showed him that asking for help is not surrender. I understand that we have all been carrying pain we did not have names for, and humans gave us the language to understand what was missing. Ral Neth's scales were doing something complicated, flattening and extending in patterns Tavian couldn't interpret. The ambassador looked at his cub, then at the humans, then at the growing assembly of station personnel who were witnessing what amounted to a cultural crisis in real time. This is... Ral Neth's voice was quieter now, uncertain. This is not how Nexarath are raised. This is not our way. Maybe, Lillian said gently, your way has a flaw in it. The ambassador was silent for a long moment. Then he turned and walked away, movements stiff, leaving Mirago standing alone in the corridor. Tavian moved to the cub's side. You okay? I may have just destroyed my diplomatic career before it began. Or started a revolution. Could go either way. Mirago's scales rippled with what might have been amusement. Humans are very strange. You see hope in catastrophe. We're optimists. It's annoying. The crowd dispersed, returning to their normal routines, because even interspecies psychological breakthroughs had to yield to shift schedules. Tavian was heading back to his quarters when his door chime activated at 300 hours. This time, it was just one visitor. Ambassador Ral Neth stood in the corridor, and he looked smaller. Not physically, but diminished somehow, like someone had removed a support beam from his internal architecture. I require information, he said formally. Tavian, running on maybe 3 hours of sleep and emotional exhaustion, just gestured him inside. The ambassador had to duck to fit through the doorway. He stood in Tavian's quarters, this massive predator surrounded by plant cuttings and human clutter, looking profoundly out of place. "The heart repair process," Ral Neth said carefully. "Does it function on adults?" "Oh, oh, yeah," Tavian said softly. "It does. I wish to understand what my cubs have experienced, what I have denied them." Ral Neth's scales were flat, making him look almost vulnerable. "What I have denied myself without knowing there was anything to deny." Tavian stood, moving slowly, and opened his arms. "Same rules as with the cubs, optional. You can stop any time. Just step forward if you want." Ral Neth stared at him, this human who barely came up to his chest, offering something the ambassador didn't have words for in his own language. Every instinct bred into Nexarath culture screamed that proximity meant danger, that touch meant violence, that accepting comfort meant admitting weakness. He stepped forward anyway. Tavian's arms went around the ambassador's shoulders, or as far as they could reach anyway. Ral Neth stood frozen, rigid, probably calculating exactly how many ways this could be a tactical error. Then something cracked. Not audibly. But Tavian felt it, the moment centuries of cultural conditioning shattered against the simple reality of being held. Ral Neth made a sound that the translator couldn't process, something between a growl and a sob. His massive arms came up, hesitant, and returned the embrace with a gentleness that must have required every ounce of control he possessed. "I did not know," the ambassador whispered. "All these years, all these cubs I raised, I did not know I was starving them, starving myself. I thought strength meant standing alone." "Sometimes," Tavian said quietly, "strength means admitting you don't have to." They stood there, human and Nexarath, while something fundamental shifted in the galaxy's understanding of what it meant to be strong. When Ral Neth finally pulled back, his scales were brighter, his eyes clearer. "I must reconsider," he said slowly. "Everything I believe about raising young, about my species, about what we have lost in pursuit of becoming warriors. That's a lot to reconsider." "Yes, but I think—" Ral Neth looked at his hands, these weapons he'd trained for combat, now learning they could offer comfort. "I think my cubs deserve better than what I was given, and perhaps I can learn to give it." He left quietly. But the next night, when the cubs formed their queue outside Tavian's door, Ambassador Ral Neth was with them. Not in line, not yet, but watching, learning. And 3 nights later, when Pixtal asked her father if he would tuck her in, Ral Neth's claws trembled as he tried, awkwardly, to hold his daughter the way humans held their young. She purred. He broke. Word spread through Nexarath diplomatic channels. Ambassadors were skeptical, but they couldn't argue with results. Ral Neth's clutch outperformed every metric. Stronger, smarter, more emotionally stable. A revolution started, quiet and small, in the touching of scales and the discovery that needing others wasn't weakness, but wisdom.